Thanks for joining us at Right On Replicas, where we're proud to bring you the best scale model kit reviews on the planet. This review covers the mid-engine Corvette EXP. It's a 1/18 scale Lindberg kit, number 6400. It might come as a surprise to many people that GM has been working on the idea of a mid-engine Corvette since Zora Duntov first suggested the idea back in the late 50s. And as we await the kit makers' versions of the new 2020 production car, here's a kit that saw it coming all along. Now, this vintage 1/18 scale snap fit kit of the 73 XP895 is long out of production, but it's still available at online auction sites at pretty reasonable prices. The original release was issued in 1977. Then Lindberg released this version and another in the 80s with a green car on the box. Now this one has a red car on the cover, but my research indicates that only the two-rotor car was red, and subsequent versions, including this four-rotor Wankel-powered car and the Aerovette, were silver. So I built this as the GM's XP895 four-rotor Wankel version. Well, that's right, this car was designed with a Wankel rotary engine. Strangely, the motor was developed by mating a pair of two-rotor Wankel engines that were developed and rejected for use in the new Chevrolet Vega. The kit's very simplistic and somewhat unfinished, as you can see through portions of the frame through the windows because there are no fender walls. It comes with about 42 pieces, molded in red and black styrene tires, chrome parts, and clear glass. There aren't any decals, and when it's done, it's about 10 inches long, 4 inches wide, and 2 1/4 inches high. Here are the contents of the kit, and the most striking features are the huge 1/18 scale body that's almost 10 inches long, and the large one-piece glass that I subsequently sectioned, as well as the hard plastic tires. There were no decals for the kit, so I had to make my own. You see a screenshot here from Microsoft PowerPoint, which makes it pretty simple, but any graphics program will work. You just print it out on inkjet paper on a color printer, and you've got decals. I also sourced a couple of extras, and you'll see where those are applied in the review. Here's the body, and it's a pretty sleek production vehicle for 1973, I think. Unfortunately, the model kit's body suffers from some molding defects. Here at the back end you can see some pronounced sink marks. And there are also some issues with a little bit of flash up on the roof line there, which is easily taken care of. And correspondingly, there are some slits that are molded into the front fender section. I assume that's to relieve the mold so that it can be pulled out, ejected. But those items would need to be fixed for a really nice looking model. So we'll show you how to do that. Molding issues in the front, right at the front of the hood line there, were the worst, and they had to be specially treated to remove them. I applied some modeling putty to the sinks and ejector pin marks on the front and back of the vehicle's body, and we're going to let that dry and start finishing that off. I added some thinned 3M auto body glaze putty that had been cut with some acetone for a nice thin layer of putty, and that really makes it a much smoother and workable finish. There were also some issues with shallow panel lines, especially where the belt line here crosses the doors. It seems like the mold makers just kind of get weak in that area, so those would need to be rescribed too. I'm going to remove these posts as they won't be needed. We're going to use some glue to assemble some of the front end components, including the front stone pan. So we'll also be filling in the screw holes in the stone pan here and removing the copyright script in the white circle. There's also a sink there right in front that needs to be refinished as well. So I marked off the posts that are corresponding on the stone pan, and we're going to take those off with a Dremel tool, or even just sand them off, however you like to remove them. On the exterior, I used some scrap pieces from the sprue trees to fill in those holes on the bottom side of the stone pan and some putty to clean up the sink marks. We'll also need to remove those tabs way up front there to allow access for the grill pieces after we put the front pan into position. And the reason we're doing that is so that we get a nice smooth contoured body without extra panel lines that weren't on the original vehicle body. We'll grab that front stone pan and we're going to super glue that into position, starting with the center and then gluing it on the edges so that we got a nice tight fit. You can finish off the putty and all of the repairs with some nice fine sandpaper. Here you see where the body has been finished sanded and all the patches have been smoothed over. Here's a close-up of the back end where the sink marks were along that tail ridge. It off and we'll give the overall body a spray with some medium gray primer. After the primer had dried, we did a little more finish sanding, and I noticed that the hood line just still wasn't quite right. The reason is because it's hard to scribe through putty. So I mixed up some 2-part putty and used that to harden properly. And before it had dried, I went ahead and re-scribed the ridge line of the front of the hood there so that I had something to work with. Looking much more cleanly now, I added some of the finishing glazing compound mix that had been thinned to finish off that front end and some of the minor details. I gave the body an overall spray with some flat black primer for a couple of reasons. I didn't want any of the paint from the red body showing through the silver, and it also gives a little definition to the panel lines. And thirdly, and most importantly, it toned down the silver a little bit to more closely match that of the production, or I should say experimental vehicle body. This was Tester's One Coat Diamond Dust Lacquer, and it dries fairly quickly. And so as soon as it did, I started to apply some of the decals that I had made, including these side body graphics for the XP 895 markings. A lot of these parts were molded in chrome, which was pretty unrealistic for suspension components and well, pulley belts. The springs also, so I put them in a bleach bath and removed them. But for the exhaust, the exhaust pipes themselves, I left chrome by simply putting just enough bleach in there to remove it from the muffler and the mounting brackets. Then I pulled them out, rinsed them off, and they were ready for use. Glue the rear axle component brackets and the front suspension in with some super glue. And there's also some ejector pin marks over the entire surface of this frame that you would remove for example, a contest kit. Now we will paint the frame and some of the other components you see here in a semi-gloss black, and I taped off the axles ends to make sure that they didn't get paint on them. What you see here is a close-up of the center console of the interior tub, and with some of the included embossed engraving for the detail there, and that's something that we're going to remove. Here's another view of that, along with a couple of holes for mounting some of the equipment. But we're going to use our own decals to substitute those features. These parts will get painted with some of the Tester's aluminum spray. It's a good match for the silver interior and a pretty good match for the casings, etc. on the equipment. While the interior tub is drying, we're going to work on some of the interior components. What you see here with the white arrow indicating is the initial instrument panel location. Now this instrument panel has 3 gauges on it, but as configured, the part doesn't really fit into that little nacelle properly. It seems to be that the dihedral, the wedges there are backwards. So I removed the gauges and then drilled a same size hole above so that I could place the steering column below that when I turn it upside down. So I used some aftermarket items and I wrapped it in foil, and those are bezels and gauges that I'll be using to replicate the dash panel. As you see it here, that's how it will work with the proper wedge shape, and the column will then be below so that you can see the gauge that's on top. The steering wheel was painted a medium gloss black, but the center hub has quite a sink in it, so that'll need to be covered up and puttied over. Also, it has a round Corvette style decal there, so I used one of the aftermarket bezels that you saw earlier to place that in the center of the wheel's hub. I started to do some test fitting of the engine components, and you're going to find that that's important, as not all of the bosses and receivers are exactly shaped properly. So when I did that, I noticed that the engine halves had quite a gap in them, and those will need to be puttied over, as well as the receiver for the one component there with the alternator on it. It needed to be widened because when you inserted it, it's kind of split the motor back in half. So that will get done here. We'll just widen that out. And also, I noticed when I added the transmission that the casing for the chain up front didn't really line up. So I had to shorten the post on the engine and make that adjustment. The mock-up of the engine with the parts fitting more properly and the front engine cover properly aligned. Of course, there was still a parting line, where the engine halves go together. So I went ahead and put some putty on that so that I could finish that off nicely. The chrome air cleaner box is one of the nicest features of the motor, and but I noticed from details that I was able to find, the sidewalls of it were gloss black. Now what I did was I used some MIG paint to fill in the ribs and give it that dark detail, but in the center I used a mix of a third craft paint black, soap, and water to color that in, and then I simply removed it from the raised lettering for the Corvette 4-rotor detail that's on it. I decided to wire the engine, so I made a distributor out of some 1/16 tubing and a toothpick, and 5 strands of wire wrap wire, and I went ahead and painted that unit black with silver stem or aluminum stem, and also made some spark plug ends there, as you can see, to put into the engine, along with some wires that I bent for some angularity on those. And we're going to drill the holes into the side of the wankle, approximately where those plugs would be, and then we can assemble the entire unit after we mount the distributor where the old one was. And I gotta admit, when I looked, I couldn't find very good detail on this, so I used the single distributor model, but some indications are that this was actually a 4-coil unit with direct to plug ignition, and a distributor for each engine, although I couldn't verify that. So I used what came with kit basically, and went ahead and wired the engine with a wire loop on the side there that I just made from a piece of scrap wire. So there it is. It comes out pretty nice, and it's an impressive display once you put it into the window viewing area on the back of the vehicle. Using some black and white printouts of the decals I was making, I sized them until I got them just right to fit into the console and supply the detail for those features. I covered the center console with some bright chrome foil from bare metal foil and burnished it after it was down. I printed out the decals in color on some decal paper and went ahead and started to apply those to the center console. I think it came out pretty nicely, and as this is an experimental vehicle, it probably did have some kind of crazy looking gauges, etc., but I noticed there was also a nice looking AM/FM radio sitting there right next to the driver and passenger seats. I added the two small pieces, the shift knob and the parking brake there, as you can see in this shot, and painted the front portion of the carpeted area of the floor black, flat black. And then there you have it. It's pretty decent looking interior, even though it's kind of plain for coloration. Adding a few details like this can really spice it up. Another thing that seemed to be called for was some seat belts. I couldn't imagine an experimental vehicle that didn't have seat belts in it, so I went ahead and used some of the model car garage units for the buckles, and then just cut some pieces of electrical tape for the belts themselves, put them together, and just laid them onto the seats. I scuffed up the tread on the tires a little bit to try and remove some of that center line mold, but they just begged for some decals. So I used some of the Eagle style decals for the sidewalls, but also there were some sinks on some of the parts, so I actually had to fill those with some of that glazing compound putty. Then I went ahead and for the wheels, I needed to paint the slots in the mag there, so I used some of that craft mix, and I painted the entire center of the wheel, and then I just rubbed off the highlighted areas, leaving the slots a dark black. Now you can just assemble the wheel sets just by gluing the wheels into the tires, and the hubcaps will be placed later, but you can also put the decals into position, and I think they really add nice treatment to this vehicle. I started working on the window glass. The window glass itself is pretty massive, and it's quite impressive. Another impressive feature of the kit. And so I taped off the A-pillar frames there and painted those black. And then, in order to ensure a proper fit, I separated the front and back halves to leave a little gap so that I could make sure that the front and rear windows fit properly into the body. Axles have been inserted into the axle brackets in the back, and you can see the red portions in the center there that are glued into the engine halves, and that provides your rear axle. I also at this time went ahead and we can glue the back plate into position on the chassis. Now we can go ahead and install the engine into position. Just pull those axles out a little bit, then reinsert them into the engine halves, and the main bracket there sits on a shelf on the back of the frame. It's a pretty positive and location, and it glues in just properly with a little extra super glue that'll keep her in position. But you see here it's fully installed, and the axles are pushed all the way into the engine half. This is a look at the engine from the top as it sits in the frame, and you can see it's nice and striking looking engine configuration. It wasn't the Chevy Orange, but it's still pretty interesting for an experimental vehicle. I drilled out the ends of the exhausts first with a pin vise drill, and then opened that up a little bit with a hobby knife, and then I painted that flat black for a little bit more authentic look. Now we can go ahead and put these parts into place. Put that plate there in the back plate if you haven't already. Glue it into position, and then we're going to add the exhaust assembly. The front bracket fits into a bracket that's near the engine, and then there's a couple of tabs at the back there that go into the back plate you just installed. Now you have to put that in first because the spring goes onto the axle mounts and the hole that's in the center of the bottom of the engine mount there. You can go ahead right now and snap the interior into place. It just snaps in, fits real snug, doesn't really need any glue. And I'm glad that I did, because later on I decided to paint the bottom of it, and I took it back off and did that. Here's the interior engine and frame subassembly. As you can see, she's coming together nicely at this point. Now we can snap the four wheels into position that the Eagle decals have dried, and later on we'll put the hubcaps in place. Build is commencing nicely, and as you can see here, you have a rolling chassis on four wheels, and the center hubs are all bright red, but they'll be covered up later on anyway, so you won't see them. We can put that center spring into place now. It's a lateral leaf spring, and of course the center post on that goes right into that hole we showed you later, and the two ends have brackets that mount into the axle brackets. So use some super glue and glue those into place. With that frame completed, for the most part, we can go back to the body, and in this case we're going to clean up the glass by dipping those large windows into some of the pledge floor finish. It really makes them look cleaner and crisper. We also will go ahead and use some detailing for the tail lights and the grill. I used some black wash for the grill ribs, and I painted the back tail lights, which were chrome ridges. I used some stoplight red for the tail lights themselves. Now we'll go ahead and install those into the back of the vehicle, and we can be adding also the Stingray emblem there on the right rear, which I saw in an artist drawing, but I never really saw any Corvette or Chevrolet markings on the body on the real vehicle. The grill inserts will need a little modification. We're going to go ahead and remove the tabs that are on there, as we won't be using those to snap fit those. We'll have to glue those into position. So go ahead and remove those indicated by the arrows there. And as you can see them on the left here, they've been removed compared to the standard one on the right. And then, like I said, we'll just sand off the edges where it contacts the body, and we'll glue them into position. As big as they were, they fit very nicely, especially cut here in the center. I used some epoxy glue actually to glue these into position. They fit very nicely, and so they 5-minute epoxy hardened, and they are nicely in position. Now I went and started working on the rest of the interior with the steering wheel and the new dashboard there, and we're going to stage those for position and place those into the body with some glue, although you may not need it. It fits right in there, but you'll have to glue the steering column into the steering hole there. And as you can see here, the red arrow indicates the blackening that's just around the panel there. That was a flat black color. So go ahead and put that into position and glue the steering wheel into place. The rubber portion of the wiper blades was painted black and flat black, and you see the arrow indicates the mounting holes here for the wiper blades. Of course, this is a massive window, so the blades are quite lengthy. Also notice here, and I used a number of variety of types of finishing. The louvers on the hood there, I used a little MIG blackening pigment, and it fills right into those pores to enhance that vent. Now it's time to go ahead and finish off those wheels with the hubcaps. Now these don't look like the EXP's 895 actual hubs. I think these were rendered from a drawing, but I just used some epoxy glue and went ahead and placed those right over the centers so as to be sure not to glue the axle, and then the wheels will continue to turn. I turned it over to look at it after I had the wheels finished. I noticed the big bright red body pan there, so as I mentioned, I just unsnapped that, painted the bottom flat black, and it just gives it a cleaner look, even though it's not a realistic body pan, but it just looked nicer to me. Look for a couple of contact points where the body meets the frame, etc. And I used a little epoxy glue there. Make sure you scrape off the paint so that the parts will stick together, and go ahead and put the body into position on the chassis. Well, there you have it. Your model's complete. This gargantuan 10-inch model car is of a scale that's very rarely found anymore, and The kits are still out there, but I'm sure they'll go fast. With a little detailing, the kit looks pretty nice. Still, it's a simplistic build. It was easy to go together, but it's very ripe for detailing because of its large scale. You could add the battery pack in the rear window area, or you could add fender walls for a more completed look. Maybe even a side view mirror. There are other details, of course, that you could add. Maybe the 4 coils and 2 distributor model. Or you could cut the motor in half and make a true 2-rotor Wankel and paint it red. Either way, it's a great looking model once you're done. And if I were you, I'd buy one and put it on my shelf. We hope you liked this step-by-step premium model kit review. And so that you don't miss any more, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can do that by clicking on the ROR icon in the right-hand lower corner of all of our reviews. Or you could find us on our Facebook page or at our website, rightonreplicas.com. Thanks!